The largest empire the ancient world had ever seen was founded by a man whose own people, before he was born, had been ordered to kill him as an infant. That order was never carried out, and the empire that grew from his survival would eventually stretch from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, ruling more people, across more languages and more gods, than any state before it. Not through erasure, as you might expect of a conqueror on that scale, but through an unusual and often overlooked strategy, leaving the conquered mostly as they were. Their temples standing, their laws intact, their own kings, in some cases, still nominally on their thrones. If that sounds like a strange way to build an empire, you are already asking the right question, and this account has almost 200 years, and then several hundred more, across 3 further empires that rose from the first one's ashes, to answer it. So dim the light near you if there is one to dim, and let yourself settle. What follows is not the story of one man or one battle. It is the story of 4 Persian empires, each built by different families, worshipping the same fire and the same God of truth in different ways, separated sometimes by conquest and sometimes by centuries of quiet transformation, Achaemenid, Parthian, and Sasanian, and then, after a storm arrived from the desert and changed the faith of an entire people. A Persia that endured under a new religion and outlasted every dynasty that tried to rule it. If you find value in this kind of slow, unhurried unfolding of the deep past, there is a subscribe button somewhere near this video, worth using only if it genuinely adds something to your evenings. It begins, as so much of ancient history does, with a child who was never supposed to grow up. The story, as later Greek historians received it, has the shape of a legend more than a chronicle, and it is worth telling that way first, before the harder evidence takes over. A Median king named Astyages, so the account goes, dreamed that his daughter's child would one day overthrow him. Frightened enough by the dream to act on it, he ordered the infant killed. The herdsman given the task could not bring himself to do it, and the boy, named Cyrus, was raised instead in a shepherd's household, his royal blood hidden in plain sight among the flocks and hillsides of the Zagros Mountains. Herodotus, writing more than a century after these events in a Greek world that was itself the great historical rival of the empire Cyrus would found, tells this story with the layered suspicion of a writer who knows he is repeating court legend rather than eyewitness fact. He offers competing versions in the same breath, admits uncertainty where his sources disagree, and lets the reader decide how much of it to believe. This account will do the same. What can be said with more confidence, drawn from cuneiform records, administrative tablets, and the archaeology of the region rather than storytelling alone, is this. Sometime in the middle of the 6th century BCE, a young man named Cyrus ruled a small kingdom called Anshan in the highlands of what is now southwestern Iran, as a vassal of the much larger Median Empire to his north. The Medes, at this point, were the dominant power of the Iranian plateau, a confederation of tribes that had, within living memory, helped bring down the Assyrian Empire, one of the most feared military states the ancient Near East had ever produced. Persia, by contrast, was a junior partner, a cluster of tribal groups occupying the region east of the Persian Gulf, sharing close linguistic and cultural roots with the Medes, paying tribute upward, and providing soldiers when called upon. The Persian and Median peoples were closely related branches of the same broader Iranian-speaking world, worshipping gods drawn from a shared ancient religious inheritance, organized in clans and tribal confederacies more than centralized bureaucracies, and, like most peoples of this era and this region, deeply engaged in a way of life built around herding, seasonal movement, and, increasingly, settled agriculture in the valleys where irrigation made it possible. What set the young ruler of Anshan apart from every other vassal king of his generation was not a birth legend involving a discarded infant, however durable that story proved to be in later retelling. It was a decision, made sometime around 553 BCE, to stop paying tribute and to win. Cyrus's rebellion against Astyages did not begin as a certain victory. The Median Empire commanded far greater resources, a longer military tradition, and, on paper, an army that should have crushed a vassal uprising within a single campaigning season. What actually happened, according to the fullest surviving account, from the Greek historian Herodotus writing generations later, is that a Median general named Harpagus, who had his own long-standing grievance against Astyages stemming from an earlier act of court cruelty involving his own son, defected to Cyrus's side at a critical moment, taking a significant portion of the Median army with him. Whether this defection unfolded exactly as later storytellers described it is impossible to confirm from the available evidence, but the underlying outcome is not in doubt. Within roughly 3 years of fighting, by around 550 BCE, Cyrus had defeated Astyages, captured the Median capital of Ecbatana, and absorbed the Median Empire's territory, administration, and much of its ruling apparatus into his own expanding kingdom. This was not, and this distinction matters, a Persian eradication of Median identity. Cyrus retained Median officials in positions of real authority, and for generations afterward, Greek writers would refer to the empire that followed almost interchangeably as Median or Persian, reflecting how thoroughly the two peoples' elites had merged in the new order rather than one simply replacing the other by force. The empire Cyrus now led is conventionally called Achaemenid, after a semi-legendary ancestor named Achaemenes whom later Persian kings, Cyrus's own line included, claimed as their founding forebear, a claim inscribed on royal monuments generations after Cyrus's death, and one modern historians treat with some caution as a piece of dynastic legitimizing rather than a confirmed genealogy. With the Medes absorbed, Cyrus controlled a realm stretching across the Iranian plateau, but he was not finished, and his next target sat to the west, ruled by a king whose wealth was already, in his own lifetime, becoming a byword for excess. Croesus, king of Lydia, ruled a kingdom in what is now western Turkey so wealthy, built substantially on control of gold-bearing rivers and lucrative trade routes, that his name would outlive his kingdom by well over 2,000 years, still surviving in the English phrase rich as Croesus for people who have never heard of Lydia at all. Watching the sudden collapse of the Median Empire and the rapid rise of the young Persian king who had absorbed it, Croesus grew uneasy enough to consult the oracle at Delphi, the most trusted source of divine guidance in the Greek world, about whether he should attack Cyrus first. The oracle's answer, as later retold, was carefully ambiguous in the way oracles tended to be. If Croesus went to war, he would destroy a great empire. Confident this meant Persia, Croesus attacked. The great empire he destroyed turned out to be his own. The military campaign that followed, in 547 or 546 BCE, ended not in a long siege but in a swift Persian assault on the Lydian capital of Sardis, reportedly stormed after Cyrus's forces found an unguarded approach up the citadel's supposedly unclimbable cliff face. Croesus was captured. What happened to him afterward is one of the empire's earliest recorded moments of unexpected mercy. Herodotus tells a vivid story of Cyrus ordering Croesus burned alive on a pyre, only to have the fire miraculously extinguished by rain after Croesus called out to the god Apollo, leading Cyrus to spare him and, in some versions, take him on afterward as a trusted advisor. Whether any of this happened as dramatically as told, the underlying pattern, a defeated king spared rather than executed, sometimes retained in an advisory or ceremonial capacity, recurs often enough across the empire's early conquests that it appears to reflect a genuine and deliberate Persian policy, not merely a flattering story invented to soften Cyrus's reputation for later audiences. With Lydia's fall, Cyrus inherited not just a kingdom but Lydia's own network of Greek subject cities along the Ionian coast, a relationship that would prove far less comfortable than the conquest of Sardis itself, and one this account will return to well before its consequences finally arrived at Marathon. For now, though, Cyrus turned his attention eastward and southward, toward the wealthiest and most ancient city remaining unconquered in the entire Near East. Babylon, in the 6th century BCE, was arguably the greatest city on earth, its famous walls celebrated by later Greek writers as one of the wonders of the ancient world, its ziggurats and canals the product of millennia of continuous urban civilization along the Tigris and Euphrates. It was also, under its final native king, Nabonidus, a city increasingly unhappy with its own government. Nabonidus had alienated much of the Babylonian priesthood by favoring the moon god Sin over Marduk, Babylon's chief deity, and had spent long stretches of his reign away from the capital entirely, residing at a remote desert oasis for reasons ancient sources describe inconsistently, leaving day-to-day rule to his son, Belshazzar. When Cyrus's forces approached Babylon in 539 BCE, the city, by most contemporary accounts, did not resist as a fortress of that scale and reputation might have been expected to. Babylonian texts describe Persian troops entering the city with minimal fighting, and a contemporary cuneiform document known as the Nabonidus Chronicle records the event with the flat, matter-of-fact tone of an administrative record rather than a chronicle of catastrophe. The city taken, Nabonidus captured, order maintained. Whether this reflected genuine popular welcome for Cyrus, effective prior diplomacy, or simply a swift military collapse the surviving sources chose to describe blandly, historians continue to debate. But the aftermath is unusually well documented, thanks to an object that would become one of the most famous artifacts to survive from the ancient Near East. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay cylinder inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform and discovered in the ruins of Babylon in 1879, records Cyrus's own account, or at least his court's official account, of the conquest, framed explicitly as a liberation rather than a subjugation. The text describes Cyrus as chosen by Marduk himself to free Babylon from Nabonidus's misrule, and goes on to describe the restoration of displaced peoples and their gods to their home cities, along with the resumption of religious rites that Nabonidus's policies had reportedly disrupted. The cylinder has, in more recent centuries, sometimes been described in popular accounts as an ancient declaration of universal human rights, a characterization most historians now regard as anachronistic and overstated, since the text is, first and foremost, a conventional piece of Mesopotamian royal propaganda, following a well-established genre in which new kings claimed divine favor and denounced their predecessors, a genre with centuries of precedent before Cyrus ever used it. What is genuinely notable, and does not require exaggeration to be significant, is the underlying policy the cylinder describes and other sources corroborate. The return of the peoples Babylon had displaced, including communities exiled their generations earlier, to their original homelands. with permission to rebuild their temples and resume their own religious practices under Persian rule rather than Babylonian control. Among the peoples affected by this policy were the Judean exiles taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar 2 decades earlier, whose return to Jerusalem and permission to rebuild their temple is recorded not only in later biblical texts. The Book of Ezra explicitly credits a decree of Cyrus for authorizing the temple's reconstruction, but reflects a broader pattern of restoration policy visible across multiple communities within the newly conquered Babylonian territories, not an isolated act of favor toward any single group. This pattern, local religious practice respected, local elites often retained in some administrative capacity, conquered populations governed rather than uprooted, would become one of the defining and most consequential features of Achaemenid rule for the 2 centuries that followed, distinguishing it in the historical memory of many conquered peoples from the harsher subjugation policies associated with earlier Near Eastern empires like Assyria. With Babylon's fall, Cyrus now ruled an empire stretching from the Aegean coast of Anatolia to the borders of India, the largest empire the world had yet seen. He would not live to see how much larger it could still become. Cyrus's death, in 530 BCE, is one of the genuinely disputed episodes of his reign, and this account will not pretend otherwise. Herodotus offers what became the most famous version, that Cyrus, campaigning against a nomadic Central Asian people called the Massagetæ, north and east of the empire's existing borders, was killed in battle against their forces, reportedly led by a queen named Tamiris who, in Herodotus's telling, had Cyrus's severed head placed in a wineskin filled with blood, fulfilling a vow to give the conqueror his fill of the bloodshed he had caused. Other ancient sources describe his death differently or far more vaguely, and the Massagetæ campaign itself is confirmed by only a handful of independent references, none of them eyewitness accounts. What can be said with confidence is narrower. Cyrus died on campaign, somewhere on the empire's eastern or northeastern frontier, after a reign of roughly 3 decades that had taken Persia from a minor vassal kingdom to the dominant power of the entire Near East. His body, by every surviving account, was returned to Pasargadae, the capital he had built in the Persian homeland, and laid in a tomb that still stands today, a modest, gabled stone structure raised on a stepped platform, its simplicity striking when set against the scale of the empire its occupant had built. Centuries later, when Alexander the Great's forces reached Pasargadae during their own conquest of Persia, Alexander reportedly ordered the tomb protected and, on finding it had been looted in the interim, had it restored, a gesture ancient sources frame as a mark of the respect Cyrus's memory commanded even among the conqueror who would ultimately end his dynasty's rule. Succession passed to Cyrus's son, Cambyses II, and the empire he inherited, though vast, was still a relatively young political structure, its administrative systems not yet fully tested by the strain of transferring power from one generation to the next. That strain would arrive almost immediately, and a conquest of extraordinary scale followed by a succession crisis nearly severe enough to unravel everything Cyrus had built. Egypt, in the 6th century BCE, remained one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth, its pharaohs tracing an unbroken tradition of kingship back well over 2,000 years by that point. It was also, by the time Cambyses turned his attention there, increasingly isolated, its former allies absorbed one by one into the Persian orbit, its own military relying heavily on Greek mercenaries whose loyalty was not always certain. In 525 BCE, Cambyses led a Persian invasion into Egypt, meeting the forces of the pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, near the Nile Delta. The Egyptian defeat there was decisive, and within a matter of months Cambyses controlled Memphis, the traditional administrative capital, and effectively the whole of Egypt. Herodotus, writing more than half a century after these events largely for a Greek audience already primed to view Persian rule with hostility, portrays Cambyses as a cruel and unstable ruler in Egypt, accusing him of desecrating the mummified body of Amasis, a previous pharaoh, and, in a particularly vivid and often repeated anecdote, of stabbing the sacred Apis bull, an animal central to Egyptian religious practice, in a fit of contemptuous rage. Egyptian sources from the period tell a noticeably different story. An inscription associated with an Egyptian official named Ajahorisnet, who served under both the last native pharaohs and the new Persian administration, describes Cambyses adopting traditional pharaonic titles, performing conventional religious rites at Egyptian temples, and generally working within existing Egyptian religious and administrative structures rather than against them. A pattern of behavior far closer to the accommodating conquest policy Cyrus had established in Babylon than to Herodotus's portrait of impious cruelty. Modern historians generally treat Herodotus's account of Cambyses in Egypt with real skepticism, reading much of it as reflecting later Egyptian resentment toward Persian rule, filtered through Greek sources hostile to Persia for their own separate political reasons, rather than as a straightforward factual record of Cambyses's actual conduct. What is not in serious dispute is that Cambyses's Egyptian campaign, whatever its precise character, extended Achaemenid control over one of the wealthiest and most prestigious territories in the ancient world, and that reports reaching Cambyses from home, while he remained occupied in Egypt, would soon force him into a hurried and fatal return march toward the heart of his own empire. The events of 522 BCE remain, even now, one of the murkiest episodes in early Achaemenid history, understood almost entirely through an account commissioned by the very man who benefited most from how the story was told. According to that account, inscribed years later on a cliff face at Behistun in western Iran, Cambyses had secretly ordered the killing of his own brother, Parthia, before departing for Egypt, fearing a rival claim to the throne. While Cambyses remained abroad, a man claiming to be Parthia, in reality, the inscription asserts, an impostor named Gaumata, a Magian priest bearing a striking physical resemblance to the murdered prince, seized the throne back in Persia, and was accepted as the legitimate king by much of the empire, apparently unaware the real Parthia was already dead. Cambyses, marching back from Egypt to confront the crisis, died before reaching Persia from an accidental wound, according to the Behistun account, though the circumstances remain genuinely unclear and some modern historians have wondered, without any way of confirming it, whether the death was less accidental than officially reported. Into this vacuum stepped a member of a collateral branch of the royal family, Darius, a young Persian noble with a claim to the throne through the shared ancestor Achaemenes, but not a direct line of descent from Cyrus himself. Darius and a group of fellow conspirators killed the man on the throne, whom Darius's own account insists was the impostor Gaumata rather than the real Parthia, and Darius proclaimed himself king. Some directness about the central difficulty here is warranted. The primary source for this entire sequence of events is Darius's own monumental inscription, carved into a cliff at his explicit order, in 3 languages, specifically to justify his own seizure of a throne he had no clear hereditary right to. A usurper claiming that the man he killed was, in fact, already an impostor is exactly the kind of claim a usurper would make regardless of whether it was true, and modern historians have long treated the Gaumata story with appropriate caution, not necessarily disbelieving it outright. since the broader pattern of a succession crisis and multiple regional revolts immediately following is independently corroborated, but recognizing that the specific framing, in which Darius appears as the loyal restorer of rightful order rather than an opportunistic usurper, serves his own legitimacy in ways that should give any careful reader pause. What followed Darius's seizure of the throne was not a smooth transition, but close to a year of scattered revolts across the empire, in Babylon, in Elam, in Media, and elsewhere, as regional leaders tested whether the new king could actually hold what Cyrus and Cambyses had built. The Behistun inscription itself catalogues these revolts and Darius's suppression of each one in exhaustive detail, presenting a portrait less of an already secure monarch than of a man who fought, methodically and repeatedly, to prove he deserved the throne he had taken. By the time the fighting settled, Darius controlled an empire fully as large as the one Cyrus had assembled, and unlike Cyrus, whose authority had rested substantially on the momentum of conquest itself, Darius set about building the administrative machinery that would let this empire actually function as one coherent state, rather than a loose collection of recently conquered territories held together by little more than the threat of Persian arms. Darius's most enduring legacy was not a battle but a bureaucracy, and it is difficult to overstate how genuinely unusual this made him among ancient conquerors, most of whom are remembered for what they destroyed rather than what they organized. He divided the empire into provinces called satrapies, each governed by an appointed satrap responsible for local administration, tax collection, and military mobilization, but subject to oversight from royal inspectors, sometimes called, in later Greek accounts, the eyes and ears of the king, who traveled the empire reporting directly back to the royal court, a system explicitly designed to prevent any single satrap from accumulating enough unchecked regional power to challenge the throne itself. To connect this vast territory, Darius built and expanded a network of roads, the most famous being the Royal Road, running roughly 2,500 kilometers from Sardis in western Anatolia to Susa in the Persian heartland, equipped with regularly spaced way stations where messengers could exchange tired horses for fresh ones. Herodotus, describing the speed of the royal messenger relay system that used this road, wrote a line that would echo, in slightly altered form, for millennia afterward, that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night stayed these messengers from completing their appointed rounds. A message that might otherwise take 90 days to travel the road's full length could, using this relay system, reach its destination in perhaps a week, a communications achievement that would not be meaningfully surpassed in this part of the world for a very long time afterward. Darius also standardized coinage, minting gold coins known as darics, and reformed the empire's tax system so that each satrapy owed a fixed, assessed tribute in a defined mix of goods and precious metal rather than an arbitrary or negotiable amount, a change that made revenue predictable for the crown and, at least in principle, made the burden on subject populations more consistent and less open to individual extortion by local officials, though how consistently this ideal was actually honored in practice across so vast and diverse an empire is difficult to verify from the surviving evidence and likely varied considerably by region and by governor. To project this new order visually, Darius began construction, around 518 BCE, of a ceremonial capital at Persepolis in the Persian heartland. Not primarily an administrative center in the way Susa or Babylon functioned, but a stage built specifically for the empire's central ritual, the receiving of tribute and homage from subject peoples during the New Year festival. The surviving reliefs at Persepolis, remarkably well preserved by the dry climate and the site's relative isolation, show long processions of delegations from across the empire: Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Indians, Scythians, and many others, each depicted in distinctive dress, bringing goods characteristic of their homeland: horses, textiles, precious metals, exotic animals. Scholars still debate exactly how to read these images as straightforward historical record of an actual annual ceremony, as idealized propaganda depicting an orderly empire that in practice involved considerably more coercion and periodic revolt than the calm procession suggests, or, more likely, as some blend of the two. A real ceremonial practice, genuinely performed, but deliberately composed and idealized in its visual telling to project an image of willing, harmonious submission that the Messier reality of imperial rule did not always match. The empire's day-to-day administration comes into much sharper focus through a very different kind of evidence than monumental relief carving. Tens of thousands of clay administrative tablets excavated at Persepolis itself, recording rations of grain, wine, and beer issued to workers, travelers, and officials moving through the imperial heartland. These Persepolis fortification tablets, written mostly in Elamite, the older administrative language of the region, retained by the Achaemenid bureaucracy alongside Aramaic, which served as a kind of practical common written language across the empire's western provinces, reveal an administration of considerable granularity, tracking rations by name, occupation, and travel route for workers ranging from common laborers to highly skilled craftsmen and, notably, groups of working women, identified by title and paid at rates that, in some specialized roles, approached or matched those of their male counterparts, including women recorded as holding supervisory positions over labor gangs of their own. Queens and royal women, too, appear in these records and elsewhere as landholders and managers of substantial economic estates in their own right, a level of documented female economic agency that later Greek writers, accustomed to more restrictive norms in their own society, sometimes described with a mixture of fascination and disapproval when writing about Persian court women such as Atassa, daughter of Cyrus and wife of Darius, whose political influence at court multiple ancient sources independently acknowledge even as they disagree on its precise extent. The religious world of Achaemenid Persia centered on a figure named Ahura Mazda, described in Darius's own inscriptions as the great god who created the earth, the sky, and mankind, and who granted Darius his kingship. Whether Darius and his predecessors were followers of the specific religious reform tradition associated with the prophet Zoroaster, usually dated by modern scholars to sometime between roughly 1500 and 1000 BCE, though this dating remains genuinely uncertain and contested, with some specialists arguing for a considerably later period, is a question ancient sources do not answer with full clarity, and this account will not claim more certainty than actually exists. What is clear is that Ahura Mazda held a uniquely elevated position in royal Achaemenid inscriptions, invoked far more consistently and prominently than any other deity, even as other gods from across the empire's many religious traditions continue to be worshipped without apparent state interference. Zoroastrian religious thought, as later texts and later practice make clearer than the sparse Achaemenid-era inscriptions alone can, centers on a cosmic struggle between truth and order, associated with Ahura Mazda, and falsehood and chaos, associated with a destructive spirit called Ingramenu. Fire held a central, though not exclusive, place in Zoroastrian ritual practice, treated as a pure and potent symbol of truth and divine presence rather than an object of worship in itself, tended in dedicated fire temples by priests called magi, a term that would eventually pass, transformed and reinterpreted into other languages and other traditions entirely, including, much later, into a well-known biblical account of visitors following a star. Achaemenid religious policy, consistent with the pattern already established at Babylon, generally did not compel conquered peoples to adopt Zoroastrian or Persian religious practice. Egyptian temples continued functioning under Egyptian priests. Babylonian religious festivals continued. Jewish communities, both those who returned to Judea and those who remained scattered across the empire, continued practicing their own faith, apparently without state interference in matters of belief, even as they remained fully subject to Persian political authority and taxation. This should not be romanticized into a modern notion of religious liberty, as later ages would come to understand that phrase, Achaemenid tolerance, was, in substantial part, a practical governing strategy for holding an enormously diverse empire together with a comparatively thin layer of Persian administrators spread across an enormous territory, not a philosophical commitment to pluralism for its own sake. But whatever its underlying motivation, its practical effect was real, and it shaped how the empire's many subject peoples remembered Persian rule for centuries after the Achaemenid dynasty itself had fallen. Zoroastrian cosmology also left a subtler, longer-reaching mark that extends well beyond Persia's own borders and beyond the Achaemenid period itself. A number of scholars of comparative religion have argued that concepts increasingly prominent in Second Temple-era Jewish thought and later inherited by Christianity and Islam alike, a coherent adversarial figure of evil, a final judgment separating the righteous from the wicked, a resurrection of the dead, and a cosmic struggle unfolding across time toward an eventual redemptive conclusion, developed with greater clarity and prominence during the very centuries when Judea existed under Persian rule, and may reflect meaningful Zoroastrian influence transmitted through that extended contact. This remains a genuinely debated proposition among historians of religion rather than a settled fact, complicated by the difficulty of dating many Zoroastrian religious texts precisely relative to the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic writings they are compared against, and this account treats it, appropriately, as an intriguing and plausible hypothesis rather than a proven chain of influence. By the reign of Darius's son and successor, this vast, religiously varied, administratively sophisticated empire stood at the height of its power, controlling territory from the Balkans to the Indus River, from the Caucasus to the first cataract of the Nile. It also stood, though no one fully realized it yet, on the edge of a conflict with a loose collection of small city-states across the Aegean Sea that would occupy Persian attention, on and off, for the better part of the next half-century, and that would leave behind, in Greek memory, a set of battle names that still echo through Western storytelling more than 2,000 years later. The Greek cities of Ionia, scattered along the Aegean coast of Anatolia, had been Persian subjects since Cyrus absorbed Lydia's former territories in the 540s BCE, ruled, in the typical Achaemenid arrangement, through local tyrants who answered to the Persian satrap based at Sardis rather than through direct Persian administration of daily civic life. This arrangement, workable for decades, came under real strain in 499 BCE, when Aristagoras, the Persian-appointed tyrant of Miletus, found himself politically exposed after a failed military expedition he had personally urged the Persians to undertake, and, facing likely removal from power for the failure, chose instead to renounce his own tyranny and call on the Ionian Greek cities to rise up against Persian rule entirely. The revolt that followed drew support from mainland Greece, though only a modest amount, Athens sent 20 ships, and the small city of Eretria sent 5. A contribution that would have been a minor historical footnote had the campaign not culminated in 498 BCE in the burning of Sardis, the regional Persian capital, including a temple to the local goddess Cybele that burned along with much of the rest of the city. The Ionian revolt itself was ultimately crushed by 493 BCE, ending with the destruction of Miletus, the revolt's original center, and the deportation of a portion of its surviving population deeper into the Persian Empire. A punishment notably harsher than the accommodating policy the empire had generally extended to newly conquered peoples elsewhere, suggesting Persian patience for rebellion, as opposed to simple conquest, had genuine limits. But the burning of Sardis had not been forgotten at the Persian court, and Darius, according to Herodotus's famous and often repeated account, is said to have kept a servant whose sole assigned task, repeated at every meal, was to remind the king 3 times, "Master, remember the Athenians." Whether this specific anecdote reflects a genuine court practice or a piece of later storytelling embellishment designed to explain Darius's motives in vivid, memorable terms, the underlying fact is not in dispute. Darius now had a clear grievance against Athens specifically, and the small, fractious city-states of mainland Greece, previously a marginal concern on the empire's western edge, had just become a target for direct Persian retaliation. Darius's punitive expedition against Athens and Eretria, launched in 490 BCE under the command of the general Datis, began well by Persian standards. Eretria fell after a short siege, and much of its population was deported, a fate the Athenians had every reason to expect awaited their own city next. The Persian fleet then landed at the plain of Marathon, roughly 40 kilometers from Athens, a location reportedly chosen on the advice of the exiled former Athenian tyrant Hippias, who accompanied the Persian expedition and hoped a Persian victory might restore him to power in the city that had cast him out years earlier. The Athenian response was, by any reasonable military calculation, close to a desperate gamble. An Athenian force of roughly 10,000 hoplites, joined by a smaller contingent from the allied city of Plataea, marched to confront a Persian force whose exact size ancient sources disagree on substantially, but which likely still significantly outnumbered the combined Greek army, particularly in cavalry, an arm in which the Greeks had essentially nothing to answer the Persian strength. What happened next, under the tactical direction of the Athenian general Miltiades, has been studied and restudied by military historians for well over 2,000 years. Rather than matching the Persian center's strength directly, the Greek line was deliberately thinned in the middle and reinforced on both flanks, allowing the wings to defeat their opposing Persian forces first and then wheel inward, catching the stronger Persian center in a pincer it had not anticipated. The result was a rout. Herodotus records Athenian losses at 192 dead against a Persian toll he places at 6,400. Figures modern historians treat with the same caution applied to most ancient battle casualty numbers, likely rounded, possibly exaggerated in the Greek favor as such figures from the winning side's own histories often were, but reflecting nonetheless what was, by any measure, a genuinely lopsided Athenian victory against a numerically superior professional force. The famous story of a runner named Phidippides sprinting the roughly 40 kilometers from Marathon to Athens, gasping out news of victory before collapsing dead from exhaustion. The origin of the modern marathon race distance does not actually appear in Herodotus's own account at all, and is now generally regarded by historians as a later embellishment, likely conflating and dramatizing separate elements of the historical record, including a genuine long-distance run Herodotus does. describe, made by a different messenger, before the battle rather than after it, seeking Spartan military assistance that ultimately arrived too late to take part in the fighting. For Athens, Marathon became an enduring point of civic pride, commemorated for generations afterward as proof that Greek citizen soldiers could defeat the might of the Persian Empire. For Darius, it was an unfinished humiliation he reportedly began planning to avenge with a far larger invasion, plans that his death in 486 BCE would leave for his son to carry out instead, on a scale far beyond anything the Aegean world had yet witnessed. Xerxes I, who succeeded his father Darius in 486 BCE after first securing his own position against a rival claim from an elder half-brother, inherited both an empire and an unfinished grievance. Before turning to Greece, he first had to suppress rebellions in Egypt and Babylon, put down with a severity, including, according to some accounts, the removal or melting down of sacred cult statues in Babylon, that marked a harder edge to Xerxes' rule than the accommodating early Achaemenid pattern this account has described so far, though how much of this apparent harshness reflects genuine policy change versus later hostile source bias remains, as with much of this reign, difficult to fully untangle. The invasion of Greece that Xerxes finally launched in 480 BCE was, by any ancient standard, an undertaking of staggering scale. Herodotus's figures for the invading force, reaching well over 1 million men in his telling, are almost universally rejected by modern historians as wildly inflated, an ancient tendency toward dramatic exaggeration compounded across a story retold many times before Herodotus ever wrote it down. Contemporary scholarly estimates, based on logistical calculations of what an army of that era could plausibly be supplied and moved with, generally suggest a force more in the range of a few hundred thousand at most, quite possibly considerably less, though even at the low end of modern estimates, this remained an army and navy of a scale mainland Greece had never before faced, engineered across the Hellespont via a pontoon bridge of lashed-together ships, and supplied by a canal Xerxes ordered cut through the isthmus at Mount Athos specifically to spare his fleet the dangerous currents that had wrecked a previous Persian expedition rounding that peninsula by sea. Against this force, a coalition of Greek city-states, never fully unified, and including states that ultimately chose to submit to Persia rather than resist, assembled a defense whose most famous moment unfolded at a narrow mountain pass called Thermopylae. There, a Spartan king named Leonidas, commanding a force ancient sources place at roughly 7,000 Greeks from various allied cities, held the pass for 2 full days against the main Persian army, using the narrow terrain to neutralize Persia's overwhelming numerical advantage. The position was ultimately compromised, according to Herodotus, when a local Greek named Ephialtes revealed a mountain path allowing Persian forces to outflank the defenders. Leonidas, learning of the encirclement, dismissed the bulk of the allied force and remained with a much smaller contingent, 300 Spartans among them, along with several hundred Thespians and Thebans whose fate ancient sources treat with considerably less romantic attention than the Spartan stand, to fight a final, doomed rearguard action that bought time for the retreat of the rest. Thermopylae was, in strictly military terms, a Persian victory. The pass was taken, and Xerxes' army advanced into central Greece, eventually burning and evacuated Athens itself. But the battle became, almost immediately in Greek memory and increasingly across the following centuries, something closer to a moral victory, proof that a small, disciplined force could inflict disproportionate cost on a vastly larger invader, a symbol later invoked by wildly different causes across more than 2,000 years of Western storytelling. not all of which reflected the actual complexity of the historical event with much fidelity. The war's true turning point came shortly afterward, not on land but at sea, in the narrow straits near the island of Salamis. There, the Athenian statesman Themistocles maneuvered the Greek fleet, reportedly through a deliberately misleading message sent to Xerxes suggesting the Greeks were preparing to retreat into fighting in confined waters where the Persian fleet's numerical superiority became a liability rather than an advantage, its larger ships struggling to maneuver in the cramped strait while lighter, more agile Greek vessels inflicted heavy losses. Xerxes, reportedly watching the battle from a hillside throne overlooking the strait, saw his fleet decisively defeated. He returned to Persia shortly afterward with much of his army, leaving a smaller force under his general Mardonius to continue the campaign, a force ultimately defeated the following year. In 479 BCE, at the Battle of Plataea, effectively ending the immediate Persian threat to mainland Greece. Though sporadic conflict along the Aegean's edges would continue for decades afterward in what later became known as the Greco-Persian War's long, uneven aftermath. For Persia, the failure to conquer Greece was a real setback, but not, in the context of an empire this vast, an existential one. The Aegean's edge remained a comparatively minor frontier region against the empire's true weight of population, wealth, and territory stretching deep into Central and South Asia. For Greece, and especially for Athens, the war's outcome fueled a golden age of confidence, wealth, and cultural achievement that would itself, generations later, produce the very conqueror who would finally bring the Achaemenid dynasty to its end. The century and a half following Xerxes' retreat from Greece is, in most popular retellings of Persian history, treated as little more than a long coda before Alexander's arrival, a judgment this account would gently push back against, since it was, in the empire's own administrative terms, a period of continued sophistication, considerable internal conflict, and real, if uneven, resilience. Xerxes himself was assassinated in 465 BCE in a palace conspiracy involving a court official named Artabanus, the first but far from the last Achaemenid monarch to die by violence within his own court rather than on any battlefield, a pattern that would recur with troubling regularity across the dynasty's remaining generations and reflects a genuine structural weakness in how Achaemenid succession worked, since the empire never developed a fully reliable, universally accepted mechanism for transferring power between kings, relying instead on a mix of hereditary preference, court faction, and, when those failed, outright violence. Artaxerxes I, Xerxes' son, reigned for roughly 4 decades of relative internal stability, and it was during his rule, in the mid-5th century BCE, that a Persian-appointed Jewish official named Nehemiah received royal permission to return to Jerusalem and oversee the rebuilding of its walls. One of several moments in this period illustrating that the empire's earlier pattern of accommodating subject religious communities persisted well beyond Cyrus's own generation, not as an isolated founding gesture but as an ongoing administrative practice. The reigns that followed grew increasingly turbulent. Darius too came to power through a coup against his half-brother. His son, Artaxerxes II, faced an attempted usurpation by his own younger brother, Cyrus the Younger, whose rebellion, famously chronicled by the Greek soldier and historian Xenophon, who served among the 10,000 Greek mercenaries hired to support the rebellion, ended with Cyrus's death at the Battle of Cunaxa in 401 BCE and the remarkable, harrowing retreat of the surviving Greek mercenary force, stranded deep in hostile territory, back to the Black Sea coast, an episode Xenophon's own account, the Anabasis, made into one of the most widely read adventure narratives to survive from the ancient world. Egypt, meanwhile, successfully broke away from Persian control entirely for roughly 60 years beginning in 404 BCE, maintaining independent native pharaonic rule until Artaxerxes III finally reconquered it in 343 BCE through a campaign ancient sources, again, largely hostile Greek and Egyptian ones, describe as unusually brutal, including alleged temple desecrations that, as with the earlier accusations against Cambyses, modern historians treat with some skepticism regarding both their scale and their accuracy. By the time Artaxerxes III's own reign ended in 338 BCE, likely through poisoning at the hands of a powerful court eunuch named Bagoas, the pattern of the late Achaemenid period had become unmistakable, an empire still commanding enormous territory, wealth, and administrative sophistication, but increasingly prone to violent succession struggles, regional revolt, and the outsized influence of court officials maneuvering behind whichever king happened to occupy the throne at a given moment. Even amid this pattern of court violence and periodic revolt, the empire's underlying economic and administrative machinery continued functioning with real sophistication across this entire period. Achaemenid coinage, particularly the gold daric first minted under Darius I, circulated widely enough to become a recognized medium of international payment well beyond Persia's own borders, and Greek writers of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE describe Persian gold being used, quite deliberately, as a tool of foreign policy in its own right, funding sympathetic factions within rival Greek city-states, and at times proving more effective at shaping Greek politics than Persian armies had ever managed to be on the battlefield. The empire's canal and irrigation infrastructure, including a canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea that Darius I had ordered completed, continued to support long-distance trade and agricultural productivity across provinces as far apart as Egypt and Bactria, and the same satrapal administrative structure Darius had designed continued, with periodic regional adjustment, to extract tribute and maintain order across the empire's enormous territory even as the throne itself changed hands violently and repeatedly at the center. It is this underlying resilience of Achaemenid administrative structure, historians increasingly emphasize, that allowed the empire to absorb a century and a half of court intrigue, regional revolt, and occasionally disastrous individual kings without the whole structure collapsing prematurely, a durability that makes its comparatively swift final defeat, still one campaign away, all the more historically striking. It was into this weakened, though still formidable, empire that a new king, Darius III, came to power in 336 BCE, the same year, on the empire's western frontier, that a young Macedonian prince named Alexander inherited his own father's throne after an assassination of his own. Alexander's invasion of the Achaemenid Empire, beginning in 334 BCE, has been told and retold so many times in Western historical memory that its sheer improbability deserves a moment's real attention. This was an extraordinary gamble, a 22-year-old king, commanding an army of roughly 40,000 men, crossing into an empire whose total resources dwarfed his own by almost any measure, whose previous kings had, within living memory, commanded armies large enough to bridge the Hellespont and dig canals through mountains. That the gamble succeeded should not obscure how far from inevitable it actually was. Alexander's first major engagement against Persian forces at the Granicus River in 334 BCE defeated a regional Persian army under local satraps, opening the way into Anatolia. The first confrontation with Darius III himself came the following year, in 333 BCE, at Issus, in what is now southeastern Turkey. A battle fought on ground that constrained Darius's numerical advantage in a manner ancient historians have compared, with some justice, to Persia's own experience at Thermopylae generations earlier, the terrain favoring the smaller, more disciplined force over sheer numbers. Darius, according to most ancient accounts, fled the field once his position became untenable, leaving behind not only his army but his own mother, wife, and children, who were captured by Alexander's forces and treated, by most surviving accounts, with a formal courtesy that Alexander seems to have calculated would serve his own broader political purposes, presenting himself less as a foreign destroyer than as a legitimate claimant to the Persian throne itself. The decisive confrontation came 2 years later, in 331 BCE, at Gaugamela, near modern-day Mosul in northern Iraq, where Darius, having had time to select the ground and assemble a far larger force than at Issus, still could not overcome Alexander's tactical skill and the discipline of the Macedonian phalanx and companion cavalry working in coordinated combination. Once again, Darius left the field before the battle's outcome was fully settled, a decision that, whatever its immediate tactical justification, proved catastrophic for his own authority and legitimacy going forward, since a Persian king who fled his own decisive battle, twice, found it increasingly difficult to command the loyalty of provincial governors watching from a distance and beginning to calculate their own futures independently of a monarch who no longer looked capable of protecting them. Gaugamela effectively broke the Achaemenid Empire's capacity for organized, centralized resistance. What remained was not a continued war between two empires but a manhunt and a slow, uneven Macedonian occupation of territory whose local governors increasingly had to decide, city by city and province by province, whether resistance still made any practical sense. Babylon and Susa, two of the empire's greatest cities, surrendered to Alexander without significant resistance in the months following Gaugamela, their governors calculating, not unreasonably, that further fighting served no purpose against an opponent who had already proven himself unbeatable in open battle. Persepolis, the great ceremonial capital Darius I had built more than a century and a half earlier, fell to Alexander's forces in early 330 BCE, and it was there that one of the most debated and consequential episodes of the entire conquest took place. Ancient sources agree that Persepolis's royal palace complex was burned during Alexander's occupation of the city, but disagree substantially on why. Some accounts describe it as a calculated act of retribution, deliberately staged to symbolically avenge the Persian burning of Athens generations earlier during Xerxes' invasion. Others, notably an account preserved by the later historian Diodorus Siculus, describe a far less deliberate scene, a drunken banquet, an Athenian courtesan named Thais reportedly urging the fire on as a symbolic act of vengeance for Athens, and Alexander himself, in this telling, joining the impulsive burning before, in some versions of the story, expressing regret for the destruction the following morning. Modern historians remain divided on which version, if either in its full detail, reflects what actually happened, and on whether the fire was limited to a portion of the palace complex or consumed it far more completely. Archaeological evidence does confirm substantial burning at the site, consistent with the ancient accounts' shared basic claim even where their explanations for it diverged sharply. Darius III, meanwhile, had fled eastward, still nominally the great king but commanding a rapidly shrinking base of genuine loyalty. In the summer of 330 BCE, he was seized by his own satrap of Bactria, a relative named Bessus, who, calculating that Darius had become more liability than asset in continuing resistance against Alexander, imprisoned him, and, as Alexander's pursuing forces closed in, had Darius killed rather than allow him to be captured alive. Alexander reportedly found Darius's body abandoned by the roadside, mortally wounded or already dead depending on which ancient account is followed, and, in a gesture ancient sources frame as respectful of Darius's royal status despite their having been enemies, arranged for the body to be sent back to Persepolis for a formal royal burial in keeping with Achaemenid tradition. With Darius III's death, the Achaemenid dynasty that Cyrus had founded roughly 2 centuries earlier came to its end. Bessus, who had murdered his own king, proclaimed himself the new great king under the name Artaxerxes V, a claim that gained him no meaningful support, and that Alexander, continuing his eastward campaign into Bactria and Sogdiana, ended within roughly a year by capturing and executing him as a regicide rather than honoring any claim to Persian legitimacy. Alexander himself increasingly adopted elements of Achaemenid court dress, ceremony, and administrative practice in the years that followed, a fusion policy that alienated some of his own Macedonian officers even as it served his evident ambition to be seen by Persia's own former subjects, not merely as a foreign conqueror but as Darius's legitimate successor on the very throne he had just ended. Alexander's death in Babylon in 323 BCE, at only 32 years old and without a clear adult heir, left behind an empire that immediately began fracturing among his surviving generals. A decades-long period of conflict historians call the Wars of the Diadochi, the successors, as these generals and their descendants fought one another for control of the territories Alexander's conquests had assembled. Out of this prolonged conflict, one of Alexander's former generals, Seleucus I Nicator, emerged by around 305 BCE with control over the largest single share of the former Achaemenid heartland, stretching from Anatolia and Syria across Mesopotamia and Persia proper into parts of Central Asia and, briefly, into contact with the Mauryan Empire on the Indian subcontinent's northwestern frontier. The Seleucid Empire that Seleucus founded represented something genuinely new in the region's history, a Greek-speaking Macedonian ruling dynasty governing a population overwhelmingly composed of Persians, Babylonians, and other established peoples of the former Achaemenid world, generally through a hybrid administrative system that retained much of the existing Achaemenid satrapal structure while introducing new Greek-style cities, called polis, populated substantially by Greek and Macedonian settlers and functioning as administrative, military, and cultural anchor points scattered across the empire's vast territory. This produced, over the roughly 2.5 centuries of Seleucid rule that followed, a genuinely distinctive cultural blending historians describe as Hellenistic. Greek artistic styles appearing in temples dedicated to older Mesopotamian and Iranian deities, Greek administrative and military terminology absorbed into local languages, and, in the other direction, older Near Eastern and Iranian religious and cultural traditions persisting, adapting, and in some cases genuinely influencing the Greek settler communities living among them rather than simply being replaced by Greek culture wholesale. Persia itself, the historical and religious heartland of the Achaemenid dynasty, occupied a somewhat peripheral position within this new Seleucid order, its great capital of Persepolis no longer serving as an active seat of imperial power, its Zoroastrian religious traditions continuing largely at a local and regional level rather than as an actively state-sponsored royal ideology in the way Darius I had once inscribed it on Behistun's cliff face. Seleucid control over the empire's eastern territories, always more tenuous than its hold on the wealthier, more urbanized western regions closer to the Mediterranean, began fraying by the mid-3rd century BCE, as Bactria in the northeast broke away under its own Greek governors and, more consequentially for the story this account is following, a semi-nomadic Iranian-speaking people from the steppes northeast of the Caspian Sea began pressing into the empire's eastern Persian territories, people who called themselves Parnai, but who would soon take the name of the very region they were about to conquer and become known to history as the Parthians. The precise founding of what became the Parthian Empire is traditionally dated to around 247 BCE, when a chieftain named Xerxes, leading the Parnai tribal confederation, established control over the region of Parthia in what is now northeastern Iran, taking advantage of Seleucid distraction elsewhere in their sprawling and increasingly overextended territory. The dynasty Xerxes founded, called Arsacid after him, would rule this region and, eventually, an empire stretching across most of the former Achaemenid heartland for close to 5 centuries, making it, by sheer duration, one of the longest-lived ruling dynasties this account will describe. Parthian expansion accelerated dramatically under Mithridates I, who reigned from roughly 171 to 132 BCE, conquering Media, then Mesopotamia itself, including the ancient city of Babylon, effectively displacing Seleucid authority from the Iranian plateau entirely and pushing the remaining Seleucid state back into a much smaller Syrian rump territory. By the 1st century BCE, Parthia had become the dominant power of the Iranian and Mesopotamian world, and, increasingly, a direct rival to an expanding Roman Republic pushing its own influence eastward across the Mediterranean and into Syria and Asia Minor. That rivalry produced one of the most famous Roman military disasters in the Republic's history. In 53 BCE, the Roman general Marcus Licinius Crassus, a member of Rome's ruling triumvirate alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey, led a large Roman army into Mesopotamia seeking military glory to match his political rivals' own battlefield reputations. At Keri, in what is now southeastern Turkey, a much smaller Parthian force under a commander named Serena employed heavily armored cataphract cavalry alongside horse archers, using a tactic that would become closely associated with Parthian warfare ever afterward. Riding at speed, firing arrows backward over their horses' rear while in apparent retreat, a maneuver still known today as the Parthian shot, from which the modern English phrase parting shot ultimately, if distantly, derives. The Roman army was devastated, losing perhaps 20,000 men killed and another 10,000 captured. Crassus himself was killed during the retreat, and the captured Roman legionary standards, a profound symbol of military and national humiliation to Rome, would not be formally returned until decades later, in 20 BCE, through diplomatic negotiation rather than any further military reckoning. Keri established a pattern that would define Roman Parthian, and later Roman Sasanian, relations for centuries, a persistent, unresolved rivalry along a shifting frontier through Mesopotamia and Armenia, punctuated by periodic wars neither empire ever proved capable of decisively winning, and by long stretches of uneasy diplomatic coexistence in between. Parthia would never conquer Rome, and Rome, despite repeated attempts across multiple emperors' reigns, would never manage to permanently subdue Parthia either. A genuine standoff between two of the ancient world's great powers that lasted, with interruptions, for the better part of 3 centuries. That standoff was not the only long-distance relationship Parthia's strategic position produced. Chinese sources from the Han Dynasty describe an explorer and diplomat named Zhang Qian, sent westward around 130 BCE seeking allies against nomadic threats to China's own frontier, returning with the first detailed Chinese accounts of the lands and kingdoms of Central Asia and, by extension, of Parthia itself, which Chinese records referred to as Anqi. Han Dynasty envoys reportedly reached the Parthian court directly by around 100 BCE, and Chinese chronicles describe Parthian officials riding out to greet these delegations with considerable ceremony, exchanging gifts including, according to later Chinese accounts, ostrich eggs, and skilled entertainers passed along the same trade corridors that would soon carry silk westward and, eventually, glassware and wool textiles eastward in return. Roman writers of this same broad era, meanwhile, knew of China only vaguely, as a distant eastern land they called Ceres, the people of silk, connected to Rome through intermediary trade rather than any direct contact, a testament to how thoroughly Parthia's central geographic position allowed it to mediate and profit from two great civilizations that otherwise had no independent knowledge of one another at all. Parthian government, unlike the more centralized Achaemenid administrative model this account described earlier, operated as a looser confederation, with considerable authority delegated to regional client kings and powerful noble families, particularly 7 prominent Parthian clans whose support was essential to any Arsacid king's ability to actually govern rather than merely claim the throne, an arrangement that gave the empire real flexibility in managing its enormously diverse territory, but also left Parthian kings chronically vulnerable to noble faction and periodic succession disputes not unlike, in their broad shape if not their specific details, the pattern that had troubled the later Achaemenid dynasty centuries earlier. Economically, Parthia occupied an extraordinarily advantageous position, sitting directly across the overland trade routes connecting the Roman Mediterranean world to Central Asia, India, and, ultimately, Han Dynasty China, the network of routes later historians would come to call the Silk Road. Parthian merchants and border officials profited substantially from taxing and facilitating this trade, and Parthian cities like Ctesiphon, which grew into one of the empire's principal capitals along the Tigris River near the site of ancient Babylon, became genuinely cosmopolitan centers where Persian, Mesopotamian, Greek, and, increasingly, Central Asian cultural influences mixed. Parthian art and religious practice reflected this same layered cultural inheritance, continuing Zoroastrian religious traditions inherited from the Achaemenid period, while also absorbing Hellenistic artistic conventions left over from the Seleucid era, visible in Parthian period coinage, sculpture, and architecture that blended Iranian and Greek stylistic elements in ways distinct from either tradition alone. Parthian power gradually weakened over the 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE, worn down by recurring internal succession conflicts among rival branches of the Arsacid family, and by the cumulative cost of repeated wars against Rome that, even when not decisively lost, steadily drained the empire's resources and periodically devastated Ctesiphon itself, which Roman forces under several different emperors managed to briefly capture and sack across this long rivalry, even though Rome could never actually hold Parthian territory permanently against the logistical challenge of governing it from so great a distance. By the early 3rd century CE, this accumulated weakness had opened the door for a regional vassal, ruling in the old Achaemenid heartland of Persis in the empire's south, to challenge Arsacid authority directly, a challenge that would end Parthian rule entirely and inaugurate a new Persian Empire, consciously and explicitly styling itself as the true restoration of Achaemenid glory after what its founders portrayed as centuries of foreign or insufficiently Persian rule. Ardashir I, a regional ruler from Persis, in the same southern Iranian heartland where Cyrus had first built his own kingdom some 7 centuries earlier, began consolidating power in the region during the early 3rd century CE, eventually leading an open rebellion against the reigning Parthian king, Artabanus IV. The decisive confrontation came in 224 CE, at the Battle of Hormozgan, where Ardashir's forces defeated and, according to most accounts, personally killed Artabanus IV, ending nearly 5 centuries of Arsacid Parthian rule and establishing what would become known as the Sasanian Empire, named for Ardashir's grandfather, Sasan, whose exact historical role remains somewhat obscure in the surviving sources but who was retroactively honored as the dynasty's founding namesake. Ardashir and his successors deliberately and explicitly framed their new dynasty as a restoration rather than merely another conquest, invoking the memory of the Achaemenid kings directly, styling themselves as heirs to Cyrus and Darius rather than to the more recently deposed Parthians, and elevating Zoroastrianism to a more actively state-sponsored and centrally organized religious status than it had held even under the Achaemenids, with an increasingly formalized priesthood and, in the centuries that followed, an increasingly codified body of Zoroastrian religious text and law. This religious centralization would prove to be one of the defining features distinguishing Sasanian rule from its Parthian predecessor, for better and, in its later, more rigid phases, sometimes for worse in terms of the empire's treatment of religious minorities within its borders. Ardashir's son and successor, Shapur I, expanded the new empire dramatically and achieved a level of sustained military success against Rome that no Parthian king had ever quite managed to replicate. In a series of campaigns through the 240s, 250s, and 260s CE, Shapur decisively defeated 3 separate Roman emperors, most dramatically the Emperor Valerian, captured alive at the Battle of Edessa in 260 CE, an almost unprecedented humiliation for Rome that Sasanian propaganda commemorated triumphantly in monumental rock reliefs still visible today, showing Valerian kneeling in submission before the Persian king. Roman and later sources describe Valerian's ultimate fate in captivity with considerable, and probably exaggerated, cruelty, including a widely repeated but likely embellished later account claiming he was used as a literal human footstool by Shapur when mounting his horse, and that his skin was preserved as a trophy after his death. Modern historians treat these more lurid details with real skepticism, as the kind of story that tends to accumulate around a genuinely humiliating historical event regardless of its precise factual accuracy, while accepting the underlying, independently corroborated fact of Valerian's capture and death in Persian captivity as one of the most remarkable Sasanian military triumphs of the empire's early history. With Rome humbled and Parthia's former territory fully absorbed, the Sasanian Empire that Ardashir and Shapur had built stood ready to enter what would become, across the following 3 centuries, its own extended golden age, an era of monumental architecture, administrative sophistication, and cultural achievement that Persian and Islamic historiography alike would remember, long after the dynasty itself had fallen, as one of the defining high points of pre-Islamic Iranian civilization. The Sasanian Empire's most celebrated ruler, at least in the eyes of most later Persian and Islamic historians looking back on this period, was Khosrow I, who reigned from 531 to 579 CE and earned the epithet Anushirvan, generally translated as of the immortal soul, a title that stuck to his name in Persian memory for well over a millennium afterward. Khosrow inherited an empire still recovering from a period of serious internal upheaval under his father, Qajar, whose reign had been disrupted by a major religious and social movement led by a figure named Mazdak, who preached, according to hostile later sources whose reliability historians reasonably question, a radical redistribution of property and, in some accounts, of wives among the community's followers, a movement that gained enough traction to briefly threaten the existing Sasanian social order before Khosrow, early in his own reign, moved decisively to suppress it. Once secure on the throne, Khosrow undertook a sweeping set of administrative and military reforms that later Sasanian and Islamic-era historians would treat as a model of good governance for centuries afterward. He reorganized the empire's tax system, shifting from a variable assessment based on annual harvest yields to a fixed land tax calculated in advance, providing more predictable state revenue while, according to Sasanian sources at least, reducing opportunities for corrupt overassessment by local officials, an echo, consciously or not, of the standardizing tax reforms Darius I had implemented in the Achaemenid Empire roughly 1,000 years earlier. He reformed military organization as well, creating a new class of lesser landed nobility, the Daikins, who served as the backbone of a reorganized cavalry force and as local administrators, reducing the crown's dependence on the great noble families whose factional rivalries had troubled earlier Sasanian and, before them, Parthian kings. Khosrow's court at Ctesiphon and the associated Sasanian capital complex became renowned across the ancient world for its scholarship and cultural patronage. The Academy of Gandhishapur in the empire's southwestern territory developed into a genuinely significant center of medical, philosophical, and scientific learning, drawing on Greek, Indian, and Mesopotamian intellectual traditions alongside Persian scholarship, and reportedly sheltering Greek philosophers who had fled the Eastern Roman Empire after the Emperor Justinian closed the Platonic Academy in Athens in 529 CE. A genuine moment of cross-civilizational intellectual exchange, even if some modern historians caution that later, more idealized Persian and Islamic-era accounts of Gandhishapur's scale and sophistication may have grown somewhat in the retelling beyond what the sparser contemporary evidence can fully confirm. The Great Arch of Ctesiphon, the Tak Kasra, an enormous brick vault that was, at the time of its construction, among the largest single-span structures built anywhere in the ancient world, still stands today. Partially collapsed but still recognizable as one of the most visible surviving physical monuments of this Sasanian Golden Age. Militarily, Khosrow's reign saw renewed and largely successful warfare against the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire, including a notably devastating raid that sacked the great Byzantine city of Antioch in 540 CE. And successful campaigns that extended Sasanian influence into Yemen and the southern Arabian Peninsula and secured the empire's eastern frontier against the Hephthalites, a Central Asian nomadic power that had troubled Khosrow's predecessors. By the time of his death in 579 CE, Khosrow I had left the Sasanian Empire at what many historians, ancient and modern alike, consider the height of its territorial extent, administrative sophistication, and cultural prestige, a peak, though no one living through it could have known this at the time, that the empire would never again fully recapture in the roughly 7 decades of Sasanian rule still remaining to it. Sasanian material culture from this period has survived in unusual abundance and quality, offering a window into court life that complements the drier administrative record. Elaborately worked silver plates, showing kings hunting lions and rams with a stylized, instantly recognizable confidence, were traded and gifted widely enough that examples have been recovered as far away as Scandinavia and China, carried along trade networks inherited and expanded from the Parthian period before them. This same era is also widely credited, in later Persian literary tradition, with the introduction to Persia of a strategy game arriving from India, Chaturanga, refined at the Sasanian court into the game known as Chaturang, and passed onward after the Islamic conquest into Arabic as Shatranj, the direct ancestor of the modern game of chess, its now familiar king, vizier turned queen, and mounted pieces still tracing their lineage back to this Sasanian court pastime. Textiles, too, carried Sasanian influence outward long after the empire's political power had faded. Elaborate silk patterns featuring paired animals framed within roundels, woven at Sasanian royal workshops, were copied and adapted by Byzantine and, later, medieval European weavers for centuries after the design's original imperial context had been largely forgotten by the artisans reproducing them. Khosrow II, who came to the Sasanian throne in 590 CE after a brief and violent succession crisis that saw him initially flee to Byzantine territory for protection before returning with Byzantine military assistance to reclaim his throne, inherited an empire still fundamentally strong but entering what would prove to be its final, most turbulent chapter. For over a decade after his restoration, Khosrow maintained a genuinely close relationship with the Byzantine Emperor Maurice, who had backed his return to power, a rare period of sustained peace along a frontier that had seen intermittent warfare for centuries. That peace collapsed in 602 CE, when Maurice was overthrown and executed in a Byzantine military coup led by a soldier named Phocas. Khosrow, citing his personal debt of loyalty to the murdered Maurice, and, more practically, seizing a moment of Byzantine political weakness, launched what would become the longest and most destructive Byzantine-Sasanian war in the centuries-long rivalry between the two empires. Sasanian forces achieved extraordinary early successes, conquering Byzantine Syria, capturing Jerusalem in 614 CE, an event Byzantine sources describe with particular anguish, since the city's most sacred Christian relic, the True Cross, was reportedly seized and carried off to the Sasanian capital as a spoil of war, and, by 619 CE, conquering Egypt as well, bringing the Nile Valley back under Persian control for the first time since the Achaemenid period nearly 1,000 years earlier. At the war's furthest extent, around 626 CE, Sasanian forces reached the Bosphorus itself, within sight of Constantinople, coordinating, according to Byzantine sources, with an Avar siege of the city from the European side. Constantinople held, and the Byzantine emperor who had inherited this catastrophic strategic position, Heraclius, mounted one of the most remarkable military reversals in ancient history, bypassing the exhausted frontier entirely, striking deep into the Sasanian heartland through the Caucasus and Mesopotamia, and decisively defeating a Sasanian army at the Battle of Nineveh in 627 CE. The following year, with his authority collapsing under the weight of catastrophic and increasingly evident military failure, Khosrow II was overthrown and executed in a palace coup led by his own son, Safavid II, who, in one of his first acts as the new Sasanian king, sued for peace with Byzantium, restoring the pre-war frontier and returning the captured True Cross. The cost of this quarter-century war, to both empires, had been immense, and neither Byzantium nor Persia had any way of knowing that this exhausting mutual conflict, which each had fought believing it was securing its own long-term survival, had instead left both empires critically weakened at the precise moment a new and entirely unanticipated power was beginning to unify on the Arabian Peninsula to their south. Safavid too himself died within months of taking the throne, likely of plague, and the Sasanian Empire that followed his death cycled through a rapid and destabilizing succession of short-reigned, often child or otherwise weak claimants, by some counts, more than a dozen different rulers across the following 4 years alone. A period of internal chaos that left the empire administratively and militarily unprepared for what was about to arrive from across its southwestern desert frontier. The rise of Islam on the Arabian Peninsula during the life of the Prophet Muhammad, who died in 632 CE, and its rapid consolidation and expansion under the caliphs who succeeded him, is a vast historical subject in its own right, and this account will focus specifically on how that expansion intersected with, and ultimately ended, the Sasanian Empire this narrative has followed for 4 centuries. Arab Muslim forces, under the political and military leadership of the early caliphate, began probing Sasanian Mesopotamian territory within just a few years of Muhammad's death, exploiting an empire that, as the previous chapter described, was still recovering from both the catastrophic Byzantine War and a subsequent period of chaotic internal succession. The decisive early confrontation came in 636 CE at the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah near the Euphrates River in central Iraq, where an Arab Muslim army under the command of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas decisively defeated a much larger Sasanian force, reportedly including the empire's prized war elephants, commanded in the field by the Sasanian general Rostam Farrukhzad, who was killed during the battle. The defeat at Al-Qadisiyah opened Mesopotamia to Arab conquest, and Ctesiphon itself, the great Sasanian capital that had stood for 4 centuries as one of the wealthiest cities in the world, fell later that same year, its treasury and royal palace complex, including the great arch of Tak Khasra this account described earlier, captured largely intact. The Sasanian state did not collapse immediately after Ctesiphon's fall, and it would be a mistake to describe the conquest as a single swift campaign rather than the harder, more prolonged process it actually was. Yazdijerd III, the young and largely powerless king who had inherited the throne amid the chaotic post-Khosrow II succession crisis, attempted to organize continued resistance from the Iranian plateau, and Sasanian forces fought a further major, ultimately decisive battle against Arab forces at Nahavand in 642 CE. A defeat later Islamic historians would remember as the victory of victories, so complete that it effectively ended any realistic prospect of a unified Sasanian military recovery. Yazdijerd III himself spent the following decade as a fugitive monarch, moving steadily eastward across the Iranian plateau seeking support that never fully materialized in sufficient strength, until he was killed near Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, in 651 CE, by most accounts, murdered by a local miller in whose mill he had sought shelter. Drawn by the wealth Yazdijerd was believed to be carrying rather than by any political motive, a strikingly undignified end for the last king of a 4th-century imperial dynasty. With Yazdijerd III's death, the Sasanian Empire, and with it the entire pre-Islamic Persian imperial tradition this account has followed from Cyrus through Darius, the Parthians, and 4 centuries of Sasanian rule, formally came to an end. The conquest of Persia's various regions by Arab Muslim forces continued unevenly for years afterward, meeting varying degrees of local resistance and accommodation depending on the region, and it would take considerably longer still, generations, in many parts of the Iranian plateau, for the region's population to convert from Zoroastrianism to the new faith in significant numbers, A gradual process rather than the sudden, complete transformation later popular memory sometimes imagines. But the political structure of ancient Persian imperial rule, unbroken in one form or another since Cyrus first rebelled against Astyages some 1100 years earlier, was genuinely and permanently over. What followed was not, however, the disappearance of Persian civilization or Persian identity, a common and understandable misconception this account wants to directly correct before moving forward. What followed instead, across the centuries this narrative will now cover more quickly, was something arguably more remarkable, a Persian cultural and linguistic tradition that survived, adapted, and in crucial respects reshaped the very Islamic civilization that had conquered it. For roughly 2 centuries following the Sasanian collapse, Persia was governed as a set of provinces within the broader Islamic Caliphate, first under the Damascus-based Umayyad dynasty and then, from 750 CE onward, under the Abbasid dynasty, whose revolution against Umayyad rule drew substantial military and political support from Persian and Persian-influenced provinces in the empire's eastern territories, particularly the region of Khorasan. Persian administrative traditions, bureaucratic practices, and even court culture and etiquette, inherited ultimately from the Sasanian model, exerted enormous influence on the new Abbasid Caliphate, whose capital, Baghdad, founded in 762 CE not far from the site of the old Sasanian capital of Ctesiphon, drew heavily on Persian architectural and administrative precedent, and whose court increasingly employed Persian bureaucratic families, most famously the Barmakids, in positions of substantial administrative authority. By the 9th and 10th centuries CE, as Abbasid central authority gradually weakened across its vast territory, a series of increasingly autonomous and eventually fully independent Persian-ruled dynasties emerged within the broader Islamic world, still nominally acknowledging the Abbasid caliph's religious authority in Baghdad but governing their own territories with genuine political independence. Among the most culturally significant of these was the Achaemenid dynasty, ruling from the city of Bokhara over much of eastern Iran and Central Asia from the 9th through the late 10th centuries, and remembered above all as the patrons of a genuine renaissance in Persian language and literature. Under Achaemenid patronage, New Persian, written now in a modified Arabic script but grammatically and substantially a direct descendant of the Middle Persian language spoken under the Sasanians, rather than a replacement by Arabic, re-emerged as a major literary language, producing poetry and prose that would form the foundation of a Persian literary tradition still read and celebrated across the Persian-speaking world today. The single most significant literary achievement of this Persian cultural revival was the Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, an epic poem of roughly 50,000 couplets composed by the poet Ferdowsi over more than 3 decades, completed around 1010 CE under the patronage, eventually, of the Ghaznavid dynasty that had by then succeeded the Samanids in the region. The Shahnameh narrates a sweeping mythologized and legendary history of Iran stretching from the creation of the world through semi-legendary early kings and heroes, and continuing through an account of the historical Sasanian dynasty down to its final defeat by Arab Muslim forces, deliberately composed, according to Ferdowsi's own stated purpose, in a Persian language kept as free as he could manage from Arabic loanwords, as a conscious act of cultural preservation at a moment when Ferdowsi and his contemporaries evidently worried that Persian language and pre-Islamic Persian historical memory might otherwise fade entirely under centuries of Arab and, increasingly, Turkic political dominance in the region. The Shahname's enduring popularity across the following millennium, recited, illustrated in lavish manuscript editions by later royal courts, and still widely known by Persian speakers today, stands as one of the clearest possible demonstrations that Persian cultural identity not only survived the end of Sasanian political power but was actively and deliberately reconstructed, in literary form, by the very generations living through Persia's transformation into an Islamic society. This same period saw the gradual but eventually decisive spread of Islam among the general Persian population, a process that unfolded over centuries rather than in the single sweeping conversion popular memory sometimes assumes, with Zoroastrian communities persisting in meaningful numbers in certain regions for a very long time afterward, and a small Zoroastrian population, along with a larger diaspora community that would eventually settle in India and become known as the Parsis, continuing. The ancient fire temple traditions this account described many chapters earlier, an unbroken practice down to the present day. Persia, by the close of this period, had become something genuinely distinctive within the broader Islamic world, a society that had adopted the new religion thoroughly and, in the coming centuries, would decisively shape one of its major theological branches, while never fully surrendering the language, literary tradition, and historical self-image inherited from the pre-Islamic empires this account has spent so long describing. This same period of Persian cultural revival under Islamic rule also produced some of the era's most significant scientific and philosophical achievements, carried out by Persian-born scholars writing substantially, though not exclusively, in Arabic, the dominant scholarly language of the broader Islamic world at the time. Ibn Sina, known in Latin Europe as Avicenna, born near Bokhara under Samanid rule in 980 CE, wrote a medical encyclopedia, the Canon of Medicine, that remained a standard reference text in both the Islamic world and, in Latin translation, in European universities for several centuries afterward. Al-Biruni, another Persian polymath of the same general era, produced influential work in astronomy, mathematics, and comparative studies of Indian religion and culture, while Omar Khayyam, active somewhat later during the Seljuk period this account is about to describe, combined significant work in algebra and calendar reform with a body of short poetic verses, the Rubaiyat, that would eventually become, through a 19th century English translation, one of the most widely read pieces of Persian poetry anywhere in the world. These figures, taken together, illustrate a broader pattern worth naming directly, the same Persian cultural and intellectual tradition that Ferdowsi worked to preserve in epic verse was, at the very same moment, actively shaping the wider scientific and philosophical life of the entire medieval Islamic world, not retreating from it. The 11th century brought a new wave of conquest to the Iranian plateau, this time from Turkic-speaking peoples migrating out of Central Asia. The Seljuk dynasty, originally a clan of Oghuz Turkic nomads who had converted to Sunni Islam, defeated the Ghaznavid dynasty and rapidly established control over most of Persia and much of the broader Middle East by the mid-11th century, eventually extending their power as far as Anatolia after a decisive victory over Byzantine forces at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 CE, an event whose consequences would echo through the region for centuries afterward, though its details belong more properly to the history of Anatolia and Byzantium than to this account's Persian focus. The Seljuks, despite their Turkic origins and language, governed their Persian territories substantially through existing Persian administrative traditions and Persian-speaking bureaucrats, most famously the Vizier Nizam al-Mulk, whose extensive administrative treatise and whose sponsorship of religious colleges, or madrasas, across the empire left a lasting institutional legacy well beyond the Seljuk dynasty's own eventual decline. Far more catastrophic than the Seljuk conquest, in terms of immediate human and material cost, was the Mongol invasion of the 13th century. Beginning in 1219 CE, Genghis Khan's forces swept through Central Asia and into Persia in a campaign of conquest that included the destruction of major cities such as Bokhara, Samarkand, and, in Persia proper, Merv and Nishapur, with contemporary and near-contemporary sources describing death tolls in these cities that modern historians generally regard as significantly exaggerated by the scale conventions of medieval chronicling, but which nonetheless clearly reflected genuine, catastrophic, large-scale destruction and mass killing by any reasonable historical standard. Mongol rule over Persia was consolidated more fully under Genghis Khan's grandson, Hulagu Khan, who founded the Ilkhanate, a Mongol-ruled successor state governing Persia and much of the surrounding region from the mid-13th century onward, and whose forces, in 1258 CE, captured and sacked Baghdad, killing the last effective Abbasid caliph and formally ending the caliphate's 5th-century political presence in the city, an event many historians treat as one of the most consequential single blows to the broader medieval Islamic world's political and intellectual infrastructure, given the concentration of libraries, scholarship, and administrative institutions the city had accumulated across 5 centuries as the caliphate's capital. Despite this initially devastating conquest, the Ilkhanate, like several of the conquering dynasties this account has already described, gradually absorbed substantial elements of Persian administrative practice and, within a few generations, of Persian and broader Islamic culture as well. The Ilkhanid rulers themselves converting to Islam by the early 14th century, and Ilkhanid patronage producing genuine achievements in Persian historiography, manuscript illustration, and architecture. During the dynasty's later, more stable decades, the Ilkhanate itself fragmented after the mid-14th century, and Persia experienced a further wave of conquest and disruption under Timur, or Tamerlane, beginning in the 1380s. A Turco-Mongol conqueror whose campaigns across Persia, Central Asia, and beyond were, by most historical accounts, extraordinarily destructive even by the standards of medieval steppe conquest. Though Timur's own capital at Samarkand, largely outside Persia proper, became under his patronage a genuine center of architectural and artistic achievement, following a pattern this narrative has now observed several times, conquerors from the steppe, having devastated much of Persia in the process of conquering it, nonetheless frequently ending by adopting, patronizing, and in some respects being culturally absorbed by the sophisticated administrative and artistic traditions of the land they had conquered. Out of the fragmented successor states following Timur's own empire's disintegration after his death in 1405 CE, Persia would, by the early 16th century, once again produce a genuinely unified native Persian empire, one that would prove, in a manner distinct from every dynasty this account has described since the fall of the Sasanians 8.5 centuries earlier, to be Persian-led, Persian-centered, and the origin of a religious identity that still substantially defines the region today. In 1501 CE, a young man named Ismail, still only in his early teens, led a militant religious movement rooted in a Sufi order his own family had led for generations in Ardabil, in northwestern Iran, to a decisive military victory that secured him control of Tabriz and, within roughly a decade of further campaigning, of the entire Iranian plateau. Proclaiming himself Shah Ismail I and founding the Safavid dynasty, the first fully native Persian imperial dynasty to rule a unified Persia since the fall of the Sasanians nearly 9 centuries earlier. Ismail's most consequential act, in terms of its lasting historical impact, was religious rather than military. He declared Twelver Shia Islam the official state religion of his new empire. In a region that had been, up to that point, majority Sunni Muslim for centuries, a dramatic, deliberately imposed religious transformation that, over the following decades and centuries, reshaped Persian religious identity so thoroughly that Shia Islam remains the dominant religious tradition of the region. Down to the present day, one of the most consequential and enduring single religious political decisions in the entire history this account has followed. This forced religious transformation was neither instant nor uniformly gentle. Sunni religious scholars and institutions faced real, sometimes severe pressure to convert or leave. Shia clergy were actively imported from other regions of the Islamic world to help establish the new religious order's institutional infrastructure, and the process took multiple generations to fully embed itself across the broader population, particularly in more remote or historically Sunni majority regions of the growing empire. The religious transformation also had significant geopolitical consequences, since it placed Safavid Persia in direct, sustained religious as well as territorial rivalry with the neighboring Sunni Ottoman Empire to its west, a rivalry that produced repeated, costly wars across the 16th and 17th centuries, including a catastrophic Safavid defeat at the Battle of Calderon in 1514 CE, where superior Ottoman artillery and firearms technology inflicted a serious blow to Safavid military prestige, though the empire itself survived and, under later rulers, substantially recovered. The Safavid Empire reached its cultural and political height under Shah Abbas I, who reigned from 1588 to 1629 CE and undertook substantial military, administrative, and economic reforms, including the creation of a new standing military corps recruited largely from Caucasian slave soldiers, reducing the crown's dependence on the same kind of powerful tribal noble factions that had periodically destabilized earlier Persian dynasties this account has described. Abbas moved the Safavid capital to Isfahan and transformed the city into one of the great architectural showpieces of the early modern Islamic world, its central square, the Naqsh-e-Jahan, ringed by monumental mosques, a royal palace, and a bustling covered bazaar, reflecting a level of deliberate, unified urban planning and artistic patronage that visiting European travelers of the period, several of whose written accounts survive, frequently described with genuine astonishment. Under Abbas, Safavid Persia also actively cultivated diplomatic and trade relationships with European powers, including England and the emerging Dutch and English trading companies, seeking counterweights to Ottoman pressure along its western frontier and access to European firearms technology and expertise. Safavid Isfahan also became one of the great centers of textile art in the early modern world, its royal workshops producing silk brocades and, above all, knotted carpets of extraordinary density and complexity that were exported and prized across Europe and Asia alike. Several surviving examples today counted among the most valuable historical textiles in the world. Safavid patronage extended as well into manuscript painting, bookbinding, and calligraphy, continuing and refining artistic traditions that stretched back through the Timurid and Ilkhanid courts this account described earlier. And Shah Abbas's own reign is remembered by many art historians as the point at which a distinctly Persian visual and architectural style, recognizable in its tilework, its garden design, and its harmonious use of color, reached its most fully realized and internationally influential form. Safavid power declined steadily after Shah Abbasi's death in 1629 CE through a succession of generally weaker rulers, increasing court factionalism, and growing internal instability, until the dynasty was effectively toppled in 1722 CE when Afghan tribal forces, exploiting this accumulated weakness, besieged and captured Isfahan itself, ending genuine Safavid political authority even though members of the dynasty continued to hold nominal, largely powerless claims to the throne for some years. Afterward, out of the chaotic period that followed, a Persian military commander named Nader Shah rose to prominence, first as a general fighting to expel the Afghan occupiers and restore order, and then, by 1736 CE, as a monarch in his own right, founding the short-lived Achaemenid dynasty. Nader Shah proved to be one of the most militarily formidable rulers in the entire span of Persian history this account has covered, leading campaigns that not only reunified Persia but extended briefly into Mesopotamia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, and, in 1739 CE, into northern India, where his forces sacked Delhi and, according to well-documented accounts, carried off enormous quantities of treasure, including the famous peacock throne originally built for the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan and the celebrated Kohinoor diamond, both of which would remain associated with Persian and, eventually, more complicated later ownership histories for generations afterward. Despite these dramatic military successes, Nader Shah's later reign grew increasingly marked by paranoia, harsh taxation to fund his constant campaigning, and brutal treatment of perceived internal rivals, including the blinding of his own son on suspicion of conspiracy, and he was ultimately assassinated by his own officers in 1747 CE. Plunging Persia back into a period of fragmentation and civil conflict. A period of relative internal recovery followed under the Zand dynasty, founded by Karim Khan Zand, who ruled, notably, without ever formally claiming the title of Shah himself, preferring the more modest title Advocate of the People, and who is generally remembered by historians with unusual favor among Persia's post-Safavid rulers for a reign, from 1751 to 1779 CE, marked by comparative internal peace, reduced taxation, and significant investment in the southern city of Shiraz, which he made his capital. Following Karim Khan's death, renewed succession conflict allowed a rival tribal leader, Aga Muhammad Khan of the Qajar tribe, to eventually reunify Persia by 1794 CE, founding the Qajar dynasty that would rule Persia for the following 131 years, a dynasty whose reign coincided, with increasing and eventually overwhelming consequence, with the rapid rise of European imperial and industrial power on Persia's borders. Qajar Persia, across the 19th century, found itself repeatedly caught between the competing regional ambitions of the expanding Russian Empire to its north and British imperial interests, centered on protecting the approaches to British India, to its south and east, a geopolitical predicament later historians would come to describe as part of the broader Great Game between these two European powers. Persia lost significant Caucasian territory to Russia through a series of 19th-century wars and treaties, and increasingly granted economically significant concessions to both foreign powers in exchange for loans, technical assistance, and diplomatic support, a pattern of growing foreign economic and political influence that fueled real domestic discontent, including the Persian Constitutional Revolution of 1905 to 1911, in which reformist merchants, clergy, and intellectuals successfully forced the reigning Shah to accept Persia's first written constitution and an elected parliament, or majlis, a genuine, though ultimately incomplete and contested, movement toward constitutional representative government that would remain a recurring and unresolved tension in Persian and, later, Iranian political life for the following century. The discovery of substantial oil reserves in southwestern Persia in 1908 CE, and the subsequent development of what became the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, added an entirely new dimension to foreign economic interest in the country, one that would shape Persian and, later, Iranian politics and foreign relations for the remainder of the century this account is now describing. Qajar authority, already weakened by decades of foreign pressure and internal political fragmentation, finally collapsed in 1925 CE when Reza Khan, an officer who had risen through the ranks of the Persian Cossack Brigade and had already effectively controlled the government for several years as a military strongman, formally deposed the last Qajar Shah and, with parliamentary approval, established himself as Reza Shah Pahlavi, founding the Pahlavi dynasty. Reza Shah pursued an aggressive program of centralized modernization across his 16-year reign, expanding the country's rail and road infrastructure, establishing a national education system and the country's first modern university, reforming the legal and judicial system along largely secular, European-influenced lines, and, in 1935 CE, formally requesting that the country be referred to internationally as Iran rather than Persia, a name the Persian-speaking population itself had long used for the country in its own language, even as Persia had remained the more common term in most European languages up to that point. These reforms came at a real and, for many of the country's citizens, difficult cost. Reza Shah's government suppressed political opposition and tribal autonomy with considerable force, and imposed rapid, top-down cultural changes, including a controversial ban on traditional forms of Islamic veiling for women, that generated significant social friction and resistance in more religiously conservative and rural communities. Reza Shah's reign ended abruptly in 1941 CE, when British and Soviet forces, concerned about his government's economic and diplomatic ties to Germany during the early years of the Second World War and eager to secure a reliable supply corridor for wartime aid to the Soviet Union, jointly invaded and occupied Iran, forcing Reza Shah's abdication in favor of his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who would remain on the throne for the following 38 years. The most politically consequential episode of the following decade came in 1953 CE, when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, who had nationalized the country's British-controlled oil industry, was removed from power in a coup organized substantially by British and American intelligence services working with domestic Iranian allies, an event whose full details remained officially unacknowledged by the foreign governments involved for many decades afterward, and whose long-term political consequences within Iran, including a marked strengthening of the Shah's own personal authority at the expense of parliamentary government in the years that immediately followed, historians continue to study and debate. Mohammad Reza Shah's subsequent decades in power were marked by substantial economic modernization, funded significantly by rapidly growing oil revenue, alongside an accelerating program of social and cultural westernization and, simultaneously, an increasingly centralized and authoritarian style of governance that tolerated little organized political opposition, relying in its later years on an extensive internal security and intelligence apparatus. Among the most significant domestic initiatives of this period was a package of reforms the Shah launched in 1963 under the name the White Revolution, encompassing land redistribution intended to break up large feudal estates in favor of the peasant farmers who worked them, the extension of voting rights to women for the first time in the country's history, and a nationwide literacy campaign carried out substantially by young conscripts assigned to rural teaching postings in lieu of standard military service. These reforms drew opposition from multiple directions at once, from some landowning elites who lost estates under the redistribution program, and, notably, from a number of religious clergy, including Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who publicly opposed specific elements of the reform package in 1963 and was arrested and briefly imprisoned as a result. An early confrontation between Khomeini and the Pahlavi state that, while not yet decisive, previewed the far larger confrontation still more than a decade away. By the 1970s, this combination, rapid, often disruptive social and economic change, visible, growing economic inequality despite the country's substantial oil wealth, the perceived erosion of religious and traditional cultural values under an increasingly Western-oriented royal court, and deep, long-accumulated resentment over the lack of genuine political freedom, had produced a broad and increasingly unified coalition of opposition, drawing support from secular nationalists, leftist political movements, and, in growing and ultimately decisive numbers, religious clergy and their followers, united chiefly by their shared opposition to continued Pahlavi rule rather than by any single shared vision of what should follow it. Through 1978, mass demonstrations against Mohammad Reza Shah's government grew in scale and frequency across Iran's major cities, met at various points with government-imposed martial law and, on several tragic occasions, lethal force against demonstrators, most notably in the city of Qom in January 1978 and in Tehran's Jaleh Square that September, incidents that further inflamed rather than suppressed the growing opposition movement. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a Shia religious scholar who had been living in exile, first in Iraq, and then, from late 1978, in France, since his own earlier opposition to the Shah's government had led to his expulsion from the country in 1964, emerged over the course of 1978 as the movement's most prominent and unifying figurehead. His sermons and statements, smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes and widely circulated despite government efforts at censorship, reaching an increasingly mobilized public even from thousands of kilometers away. By December 1978, strikes had spread across much of the country's economy, including, critically, its oil industry, and the scale of continued street demonstrations had made the Shah's position increasingly untenable. On the 16th of January, 1979, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi departed Iran, officially described at the time as a temporary trip for reasons of rest and medical treatment abroad, though he would never return to the country as its ruler again. Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Iran from exile on the 1st of February, 1979. Greeted in Tehran by crowds that many contemporary journalists and later historians estimated in the millions, among the largest single gatherings of people the country had ever seen. Within days, the last Pahlavi-appointed prime minister's government collapsed amid continued military defections and popular unrest, and on the 11th of February, 1979, the Pahlavi monarchy's remaining formal governing structures dissolved entirely, marking the effective end of Pahlavi rule. A national referendum at the end of March 1979 formally established the Islamic Republic of Iran and a new constitution, incorporating a central role for Shia religious authority within the new state's governing structure, was adopted later that same year. With this transformation, the line of Persian monarchy, a line stretching back through the Pahlavis, the Qajars, the Zands, the Afsharids, the Safavids, and, centuries further back still, through the Islamic caliphates, the Sasanians, the Parthians, and the Seleucids, all the way to Cyrus the Great's founding of the Achaemenid Empire in the 6th century BCE, more than 2,500 years earlier, came to its final end. This account will go no further than this. What followed 1979, and how it shaped the decades since, belongs to a more recent and more contested history than the one this account has set out to tell, one this account deliberately leaves to other tellers, and to your own understanding of the present day, rather than attempting to narrate here. What this account can offer, instead, in closing, is a final look backward across the full arc of everything you have just heard, 25 centuries of empires rising from mountain kingdoms, falling to conquerors, and again, finding some way to endure. Consider, for a moment, everything that has passed since a shepherd's household in the Zagros Mountains sheltered a child said to be destined for a throne he was never supposed to reach. An empire built on an unusual, calculated tolerance for the customs and gods of conquered peoples. A road system fast enough that a message could cross more than 2,000 kilometers in about a week. A defeated marathon that became, in Greek memory, a founding legend of resistance against impossible odds. A young Macedonian king who ended one dynasty while dressing, in his final years, in the clothes of the very empire he had conquered. A steppe people who mastered the art of striking while in retreat, and held off Rome for 3 centuries without ever fully defeating it. A dynasty that rebuilt Achaemenid glory in brick and stone, captured a Roman emperor, and eventually exhausted itself in a war against Byzantium so total that neither side saw the storm gathering in the deserts to their south. And then, after that storm arrived and ended the political line of pre-Islamic Persian kingship forever, something that did not, in fact, end at all. A language, deliberately rescued and rewoven into 50,000 couplets of epic poetry by a poet determined that his people's pre-Islamic memory would not simply dissolve into someone else's language. A wave of steppe conquerors, arriving as destroyers, who again and again found themselves absorbed by the very civilization they had set out to destroy. A teenage religious leader who reshaped the region's faith so completely that its consequences are still visible many centuries later. Dynasty after dynasty, rising from tribal confederations and military strongmen alike, each one claiming, in its own way, some connection to the deep well of Persian kingship this account has traced from its very beginning. What should you take from 2,500 years compressed into a single telling? Perhaps this, that empires, even the largest and most seemingly permanent ones, are built by people improvising under pressure, a rebellious vassal king, a usurper justifying his own crime, a general capitalizing on a rival's momentary weakness, a poet trying to save a language he feared was slipping away. None of them, at the time, knew how their choices would be remembered. None of them could have imagined that a clay cylinder buried in Babylon, or an epic poem composed centuries after the empire it describes had already fallen, would still be read, translated, and studied thousands of years later, by people living in a world none of them could have begun to picture. That, more than any single battle or any single king, may be the truest legacy of the Persian Empire in all its forms, not permanence, since nothing here proved permanent, but a persistence of memory and culture that outlasted every throne it produced. The mountains where a shepherd once raised a child who was never supposed to survive are still there. The rivers Cyrus crossed, the pass Leonidas held, the arch still standing, half collapsed, over the ruins of Ctesiphon, all of it is still there, waiting, the way it always has, for the next person willing to listen closely enough to hear what it still has to say. Rest now. The empires are done rising and falling for tonight.